I was at a neighborhood barbecue last month, talking to a guy I've known for years. He's a smart person, runs his own small business. But when the conversation turned to politics, his entire demeanor changed. He started talking about a specific political figure, and his eyes just lit up. He wasn't discussing policy. He was describing this person as a savior, the only one who understands the real people. He spoke with this intense, emotional certainty, painting a black and white picture of the world. Us, the hardworking patriots, against them, a corrupt, shadowy elite pulling all the strings. I listened for a bit, and then, just trying to follow the logic, I brought up a simple, verifiable fact, a statistic from a government report that challenged one of his claims. The shift was instantaneous. His face hardened. He didn't address the fact. He didn't offer a counter-argument. He just leaned in and said with genuine anger, "So you believe their lies, huh? I guess I know which side you're on." It wasn't a discussion. It was a loyalty test. And that moment, that complete shutdown of reason in favor of absolute emotional allegiance, made me realize I wasn't just talking to my neighbor anymore. I was seeing something else entirely.
Wow. Yeah, that anecdote, it just perfectly captures the kind of crisis we're really grappling with today, doesn't it?
It really does.
It shows exactly how politics in many ways has sort of devolved. It's moved away from, debating policies or shared goals and become much more about raw identity, about tribalism, pure emotional allegiance. You saw it right there.
Yeah.
That moment when someone stops seeing their political opposition as, well, a legitimate rival you argue with and start seeing them as an enemy, an existential threat that has to be, defeated or even destroyed.
Exactly. And the research we've been looking at, it confirms this isn't just like a few isolated incidents or individual frustrations. It feels much bigger.
Oh, absolutely. It's a systemic vulnerability, something that genuinely threatens how democracy is supposed to function.
Right.
And that's the crucial shift in how we need to understand this. For a long time, people saw populism mainly as a symptom.
A symptom of what, exactly?
Well, a symptom of other problems. Underlying democratic failures, maybe. Things like huge economic inequality or that general unease people feel about globalization happening so fast, or even just traditional political parties kind of losing their grip.
Okay, so like an understandable reaction to real problems.
Exactly. That was the view. But the research we have now, it's pretty unambiguous. The actual strategies that populists use, they're not just expressing those symptoms anymore.
They're causing their own problems.
Precisely. They are becoming a direct systemic threat in themselves because the tactics they employ, deliberately weakening institutions, fueling polarization, they undermine the whole system's ability to actually resolve conflict or govern effectively.
So that's our mission for this deep dive then. We need to get into this convergence of crises. We've got to look under the hood, really understand the psychological vulnerabilities that human fuel that these leaders tap into.
Right. What makes people receptive?
Yeah. And then we have to follow that into the digital world, analyze the algorithms, the mechanisms that just seem to accelerate these dynamics, turning anxiety into mass outrage.
The digital amplifier effect.
Exactly. And finally, critically, we need to explore what can actually be done. What are the institutional strategies, the political reforms? How can we build up genuine democratic resilience against this erosion?
Okay, let's do it.
Right. Let's start with that human core then, the fuel. We often hear this simple story, right, that populism is just about economics, the poor rising up against the rich. But when you look at the initial academic findings on what actually drives this, it's a bit counterintuitive about where economic grievance really fits in.
That's probably the most crucial piece of nuance to get right, actually, because, early research did establish that overall economic hardship, just being poor or generally unhappy with the economy, it actually plays only a modest role in driving support specifically for right-wing populism.
Only modest. Compared to what?
Compared to really potent factors like, say, nativism or strong anti-immigrant sentiment, there were studies back in 2014, 2015 looking across different European countries, and they found that general economic dissatisfaction just wasn't the main thing, not the strongly correlated variable explaining votes for these parties.
Okay, so the simple idea, I'm broke, so I'm voting populist. That doesn't really hold up on its own, not until we sort of adjust the focus a bit.
Exactly. And this is where the concept of status anxiety becomes incredibly important. It's less about absolute loss, like how much money you have.
And more about where you stand relative to others.
Precisely. Economic deprivation, it seems, only really becomes a powerful political force when it gets filtered through the lens of group identity, or when it triggers this deep-seated status anxiety.
Can you unpack that shift a bit more?
Sure. The key psychological move is from an individual fear, a material fear, gosh, I might lose my job, to a collective identity-based fear, something like, wait a minute, people in my group seem to be losing jobs or maybe losing cultural influence or even just their historical status, and they're losing it to another group.
Ah, okay, so it's about the group's standing declining, relatively speaking.
Yes. That perceived relative decline in the group's place in society, not necessarily just absolute poverty, that's the truly fertile ground populists know how to cultivate. When a group that has traditionally been dominant feels like their position in the social hierarchy is under threat, whether economically or culturally, they become much, much more receptive to that simple populist message of us versus them.
And this worry about losing status, it must get amplified when people already lack faith in the system, in the institutions that are supposed to be managing things. That trust deficit seems huge.
It creates the perfect storm, the perfect opening. The feeling that established government, traditional political institutions are just unresponsive, maybe ineffective, possibly even corrupt. That's absolutely central to the appeal.
You see the numbers, and they're just staggering.
They really are. Look at the U.S. recent polls showing only about 17% of Americans say they trust the government in Washington, always or most of the time. I mean, 17%. That's not a minor issue. It's systemic.
Wow.
And it's not just a U.S. thing. Back in 2018, you saw really low trust figures across Europe, too. France was down at 33%, the U.K. at 36%. Even Germany, which is often seen as more stable, was only at 55% trusting their national parliament.
That paints a pretty bleak picture. When people think the system is fundamentally broken or rigged,
along comes the populist who validates that exact feeling. They say, yeah, you're right, the elite is corrupt, and guess what? I'm the only one who actually gets it, who represents the pure, honest will of the real people.
and that sets the stage perfectly for mobilizing. Resentment. That seems to be the core political emotion we're talking about.
Absolutely. Resentment is key. But we need to be really specific about what we mean by political resentment here. Sociologists often root it in something called fraternalistic relative deprivation.
Okay, fraternalistic relative deprivation. That's a bit of a mouthful. How do we break that down for people listening?
Let's try. Simply put, it's not just about feeling personally hard done by that would be egoistic deprivation. It's about feeling that your group, that's the fraternalistic part, is worse off compared to some other group that you see as unfairly privileged. That's the relative part.
So it's a group feeling. My group is getting cheated compared to them.
Exactly. A group feeling of being cheated. And when this gets mobilized politically, it usually has three core interlocking parts.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's a situation of perceived injustice, a sense that something deeply unfair has happened or is happening to your group.
Right, unfairness.
Second, there's a feeling of intense hostility, real anger directed towards whoever is seen as the wrongdoer, the ones causing the injustice.
Okay, anger at the perceived source.
And third, there's often a powerful, sometimes very explicit desire for retaliation, a psychological need to kind of get even with those who caused the unfairness.
So it's the mix. Grievance plus anger plus this demand for payback. And this emotional structure you're saying is particularly characteristic of right-wing populism. Makes it different from the radical left.
That's a really key distinction in how these things are often categorized, yes. While radical left-wing populism tends to be, bipartite, it frames the conflict as simply the people versus the economic elites, the 1%, the banks, big corporations.
It's just two players.
Yeah.
People versus elites.
Right. But right-wing populism is usually tripartite. It sets up the world as the pure people against the corrupt elite, but also against an outgroup.
A third element.
Yes. And that outgroup is often defined along ethnic or religious or racial lines. Think immigrants, specific minority groups, or sometimes even cosmopolitan intellectuals. So the political conversation becomes driven by resentment, aimed both upwards at the economic elite and outwards at the perceived threat or unfair privilege given to these minority outgroups.
Okay, let's dig into how they mobilize this. Because the research identifies three specific kinds of resentment they tap into. Really shows their tactical flexibility. First up is redistributive resentment about material stuff, the economic pie.
Right. Redistributive resentment is all about tangible resources, Jobs, housing, healthcare benefits, money, and it gets mobilized mainly through two really powerful narratives.
What's the first one?
The first is welfare chauvinism. This is that kind of exclusionary talk that paints non-natives, immigrants, refugees, maybe even certain internal minorities as getting an unfair advantage when it comes to state resources.
Taking more than their fair share.
Exactly. And the populist promise is basically, we'll stop this unfairness, we'll make sure resources go back to the deserving natives.
So they deliberately pit groups of citizens who might both be struggling against each other.
Precisely. They draw a sharp contrast between the supposedly undeserving non-natives and the deserving natives, the elderly, the sick, the hardworking local folks who they say are entitled to the whole cake.
Yeah.
It plays on that powerful zero-sum idea. There's only so much to go around, and they're taking what we built and earned.
Okay, that's welfare chauvinism. What's the second route under redistributive resentment? This one targets elites, called culturalized producerism.
Yeah, this shifts the focus slightly. It targets economic elites by blaming, say, globalist actors or big corporations for creating tax injustice, an injustice that, they argue, disproportionately hurts the real producers of the nation.
Who are the producers in this narrative?
Usually small and medium-sized businesses, the middle class. They're positioned as the virtuous victims, squeezed between these globalist profiteers at the top and the demands of the outgroups at the bottom, who are supposedly draining resources.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The National Rally Party in France, for instance, has used specific financial figures to argue that the tax burden on SMEs, small businesses, is like 3 times higher than the tax on the huge CAC 40 companies. This makes the middle-class producer feel like the victim of elite corruption and unfair tax policies.
What really surprised me here was seeing anti-environmental positions mobilized under this category. Feels like a policy issue, but it gets framed as basically resource theft.
It's a perfect example of how populists are so adept at reframing complex issues into these simple resentment narratives. They'll take anti-environmental stances, sure, but they frame the costs of climate action as, quote, an insidious inversion of commonsensical priorities.
Meaning what?
Meaning they argue the political elite is prioritizing abstract environmental goals or, unworldly climate preachers over the immediate material needs of our people's pockets.
Hitting the wallet.
Exactly. It taps directly into economic anxiety. They highlight concrete things like energy poverty, claiming ordinary households can't afford to heat their homes because, quote, climate frenzy has turned energy into an extremely expensive luxury product. This framing turns what could be a policy debate into a moral outrage. The elite is stealing resources from the hardworking native poor to satisfy these out-of-touch environmentalists.
That is a really powerful emotional sleight of hand. Okay, moving on. The second category is recognitory resentment. This targets something less tangible, symbolic status, cultural dignity.
Right. Recognitory resentment is all about identity. It's about dignity, about who gets seen, who gets honored, whose values matter in society. The core argument populists make here is that the globalist liberal elites obsessed with political correctness and social justice have unfairly elevated the status and recognition of certain groups.
Like ethnic or sexual minorities.
Exactly. Things like promoting LGBTQ rights, multicultural policies, diversity initiatives, while at the same time, the traditional historical majority group feels like they are being dishonored, devalued, ignored, or even shamed.
So if redistributive was about who gets the economic pie, recognitory is about who gets invited to the party, who gets respect.
That's a great way to put it. It's the feeling that the majority's cultural space, their identity, their traditions are being actively restricted or pushed aside to make room for other groups. And it's often portrayed as this radical inversion of priorities. Like the elites are supposedly banning or criticizing the majority's religious traditions, maybe citing political correctness, while simultaneously giving excessive support and visibility to the cultural or religious practices of newcomer minorities. You might hear complaints about, say, extensive TV coverage for a minority religious festival, while a traditional majority holiday gets downplayed.
That feeling of symbolic marginalization, being ignored or disrespected, that sounds potent. It fuels this sense of reverse discrimination almost.
Very potent, a sense of reversed affirmative action, but for symbolic status and recognition.
Okay, and the third category, retributive resentment, seems to tap into really primal feelings about justice, safety, often through something called penal populism.
Yeah, retributive resentment hits deep because it connects to that basic human desire for justice and security. It tends to focus heavily on simplifying complex crime issues into a really stark binary. You're either a victim or a perpetrator.
Good guys and bad guys.
Exactly. And the perceived injustice here is that the justice system, which they'll say is controlled by lenient, out-of-touch intellectual elites, is soft on criminals, especially if those criminals belong to an outgroup, but disproportionately hard on the victims, who are always portrayed as belonging to the in-group, the U.S.
Which provides a very clear target for that desire for retaliation you mentioned earlier.
Crystal clear. It demands vengeance. The French National Rally, for example, once made the incredibly inflammatory claim, quote, "In France, only the victims are executed." Now, that massively oversimplifies incredibly complex criminal justice realities, but it distills it down into one single, emotionally powerful narrative. The system is unjust, it protects the criminals, them, and punishes the victims, us, and we need immediate, harsh payback.
It's clear populists offer this potent emotional package deal to explain a whole range of anxieties, economic, cultural, safety. But as the research points out, just holding these attitudes isn't enough, right? They need to be activated by the political context to really drive political action.
Context is absolutely everything. And specifically, the politician's ability to shape and control that context is key. You know, lots of people might hold latent populist or nativist views, but often they're secondary concerns.
Not top of mind, usually.
Right. They don't become politically decisive until some political actor manages to drag them right to the forefront, making them the most salient issue, the thing everyone is talking about and voting on.
Can you give us a concrete example of this activation principle in action?
Sure. Think about Prime Minister Orban in Hungary. He very successfully managed to redefine the entire political contest almost exclusively around the issue of immigration.
How did he do that?
Well, before his big push, immigration was an issue, yes, but it wasn't the single defining feature of Hungarian politics. Orban deliberately escalated it. He closed borders, built fences, and relentlessly presented migrants not as individuals or potential workers, but as the clear, immediate, existential enemy of the Hungarian nation. By doing that, he fundamentally shifted the whole political context. He ensured that voters, whatever they thought about healthcare or schools, were primarily casting their ballot through the lens of identity, fear, and the migration issue he had foregrounded.
Making it the only game in town.
Essentially, yes. And similarly, research on the 2016 U.S. election suggests that while racial concerns certainly weren't new, the specific rhetoric used in that campaign dramatically increased the salience, the prominence of identity issues for voters. And that shift ultimately favored the populist candidate.
So, successful populists are masters at controlling the agenda and framing the dominant emotion.
They have to be. They win by forcefully setting the terms of the debate and controlling the prevailing emotional frame.
And that successful control of the agenda leads us right into Section 2. Because the digital ecosystem, social media, it seems like the perfect tool set for amplifying those pre-existing emotions and social divisions we just talked about.
Oh, absolutely.
Algorithms are meant to help us sort through the flood of information, but they seem to be creating a system that's, well, optimized for democratic ill health.
They're deeply paradoxical tools, aren't they? On the one hand, they're everywhere and, frankly, necessary. Without algorithms, we'd just be drowning in the sheer volume of online content. We couldn't function.
True.
But the fundamental conflict comes from their design objective. These algorithms are not engineered, not built for democratic health or societal cohesion or citizen well-being. That's not their purpose.
What is their purpose then?
Their sole purpose, really, is to generate wealth for the platforms. And they do that by optimizing for one thing: short-term profit via maximum user engagement.
And we know what drives engagement, right? It's not usually thoughtful, nuanced debate about policy.
Not at all. It's outrage, hostility, strong emotions, speed, extremity, immediate reactions. The systems reward that.
So what's really fascinating, according to the research, is that algorithms don't necessarily create this polarization from scratch. They're not always the root cause.
That seems to be the consensus from rigorous studies. They rarely are the single originating cause. But what they do act as is a powerful accelerant, a booster rocket.
How so?
They reinforce the existing social and psychological drivers we were just discussing. They kind of trap users in this complex, self-perpetuating feedback loop. They feed off the existing societal context, the populism, the distrust, the individualism, and then they amplify it almost infinitely.
So they function like an effective amplifier, turning up the volume, not on facts necessarily, but on feelings.
Precisely. Effective amplifier is a great term. They definitely seem to increase effective polarization. And that's a crucial distinction. It's not just disagreeing on policy, that's cognitive polarization. It's about heightening those feelings of intense hostility, negativity, dislike towards the political other, the enemy or outgroup you were talking about with your neighbor.
And why do they do that? Just because angry content gets more clicks?
Pretty much. Because the algorithms are designed to prioritize engagement metrics, clicks, time spent on site, shares, angry emoji reactions, they naturally tend to push users towards content that is more extreme, more sensational, more likely to provoke outrage. The Washington Post, I remember, highlighted findings showing that platforms implicitly reward content that evokes anger. It makes hostility and division a highly profitable, perfectly optimized product for them.
Which means those emotionally charged, simplified populist narratives blaming the outgroup, attacking the corrupt elite, are exactly the kind of content the algorithm is designed to spread fastest and furthest.
Tailor-made for algorithmic amplification.
Which then leads us to a really frustrating point for anyone who hopes we can fix this just by giving people better information. The apparent ineffectiveness of simple fact-checking.
Ah, yes, the educate the other side fallacy. It's often the first instinct, isn't it? Especially for well-meaning people.
Yeah, you think, if they only knew the facts.
Exactly. We assume if we just expose people to the actual facts or break them out of their echo chambers by showing them balanced, contradictory views, they'll logically process the truth and become more moderate. Unfortunately, the research here is really quite clear and, frankly, a bit depressing. It shows this approach is largely ineffective. And worse, under certain circumstances, it can actually accentuate the very polarization you're trying to reduce.
Wait, hang on. How can showing someone verifiable facts, say, about climate change science or gun violence statistics, make them dig in harder on their original incorrect position? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it happens because when facts become culturally divisive, when they touch on those deep-seated group identity issues we talked about, the psychological pressure to maintain group loyalty often becomes much stronger than the personal incentive to get the right answer. If accepting a specific fact would mean you have to abandon the shared belief system of your social group, your political tribe, well, many people will subconsciously reject the fact because belonging to the group feels more important for their identity, maybe even their sense of safety, than accepting an uncomfortable objective truth.
It becomes a loyalty test again. Just like at the barbecue, believing the fact means betraying your side.
Precisely that. And what's particularly startling is a finding about highly educated individuals.
What about them?
You might think they'd be better at evaluating evidence objectively, but often they're actually more adept at this kind of defensive reasoning, sometimes called motivated reasoning, meaning they use their advanced reasoning skills not necessarily to find the truth, but to skillfully find evidence or construct really sophisticated arguments that support their existing group-aligned beliefs. They're better at rationalizing.
Wow. So being smarter can actually make you better at reinforcing your own biases on these identity-linked issues.
In some cases, yes. The net effect can be that the most informed, best-educated members on each side of a polarized issue become the most effective and articulate defenders of their side's narrative, regardless of contradictory external facts, which of course just aggravates the polarization further, especially among the political class and engaged citizens.
Okay, so if just relying on individuals becoming more digitally literate is likely a losing battle when group identity is this powerful, the spotlight has to turn towards the platforms themselves. Platform accountability, and the massive challenges they face with moderation.
Huge challenges.
They seem to get slammed constantly from both sides, right? For doing too much moderation and for doing too little.
It's a classic double bind, a really difficult, almost impossible paradox they're caught in. On one side, yes, constant criticism for over-moderation.
Accusations of censorship, suppressing legal speech.
Right. Or claims they disproportionately downrank or remove content from certain political groups. And these demotion practices, where content isn't removed but just shown less often, are often automated and incredibly hard for outsiders to track or measure.
Why is that?
Largely because the systems are proprietary. The companies keep their algorithms secret, so there's this significant self-imposed transparency gap. We can't easily audit why certain content gets suppressed while other content fly.
Okay, so that's the over-moderation complaint.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, they get hammered for under-moderation, for failing to take down genuinely harmful stuff.
And that criticism is particularly sharp when it comes to non-English content or content affecting communities outside North America and Western Europe.
Why the difference there?
Well, research strongly indicates that the automated moderation systems, the AI, are often significantly less effective at catching things like hate speech, incitement to violence, or dangerous misinformation when it's not in English.
Is that a technical problem?
No.
Or a resource problem?
It seems to be both, really. It stems from several shortcomings. Often there's a lack of good training data for the machine learning models in less common languages, or they fail to employ enough human moderators who are fluent in those languages and understand the specific cultural context, the nuances, the sarcasm. Or sometimes, perhaps cynically, it's just about resources. They may not allocate enough funding or staff for moderation in countries or languages that are considered lower priority profit centers. And the result is that harmful content can spread much more easily, often unchecked, in those non-English speaking communities.
Given these kinds of systemic failures, the transparency gap, the moderation inconsistencies, it's no surprise that governments, especially the U.S. Congress, have started looking seriously at policy responses. And they seem very focused on the algorithms themselves.
That definitely seems to be the main policy direction, yes. Trying to tame the algorithm, since it's seen as the core accelerant. Legislators have been considering several major angles on this.
Like what?
Well, one primary approach is to target the recommendation algorithms directly. Some proposals have suggested limiting or even banning their use altogether, particularly for children and teenagers.
Or giving users more control.
Exactly. Other proposals would require platforms to offer users alternative ways to see their feeds, maybe a simple chronological feed, without the algorithm deciding what you see based on predicted engagement. The logic is pretty clear. Break that optimization loop that seems to profit from outrage and extremity.
Makes sense. Beyond just limiting them, there's also a big push for more transparency and oversight, right? To close that gap you mentioned.
Absolutely. Transparency and external audits are seen as critical. Some legislative ideas include mandatory disclosure requirements forcing companies to actually explain in plain terms how their algorithms prioritize and distribute content.
So we can understand what's happening under the hood.
Right. And furthermore, there are proposals that would require platforms to undergo regular third-party risk and impact assessments. Essentially, independent audits looking at the societal effects of their systems. These reports might then have to be submitted to regulatory agencies, like the Federal Trade Commission perhaps, for review and potential investigation. The goal is to pry open those black boxes just enough so society can understand, measure, and hopefully mitigate the negative impacts.
But every potential solution seems to come with huge potential downsides. And the real elephant in the room when talking about platform liability is Section 230. Amending that sounds incredibly complex.
Oh, it's a massive, high-stakes policy gamble. Truly complex. The debate around Section 230 that legal shield platforms have has really centered on whether to remove those liability protections specifically for the content amplified by their recommendation algorithms.
So not for hosting content generally, but for actively promoting it.
That's the idea. The argument is, if platforms aren't just passively hosting content, but are actively choosing to push harmful, polarizing, maybe even demagogic stuff to users via their profit-driven algorithms, then maybe they should be held legally liable for the resulting harm, unlike, say, a neutral telephone company.
But what are the risks there? Wouldn't restricting these big platforms just push all that really extreme stuff into darker corners of the internet? Places that are harder to monitor, maybe making radicalization worse?
That is precisely the core fear, the major policy risk. Amending Section 230 could have really significant unintended consequences.
Like what?
Well, if the legal risk of algorithmic amplification becomes too high, platforms might swing drastically towards overmoderation. They might start censoring or removing huge amounts of borderline, but basically lawful speech just to avoid any possible lawsuit. That has free speech implications.
Okay. Or could they go the other way?
Potentially. They might choose under moderation if they decide they simply can't afford the legal risk or the cost of perfectly moderating everything algorithmically recommended. This could also give the giant incumbent platforms, the ones with deep pockets for lawyers, a massive competitive advantage over smaller startups who can't afford that risk.
So it's a really tricky balancing act.
Extremely tricky, balancing free speech, platform accountability, market competition, and public safety. How Section 230 might eventually be modified, if at all, will be hugely consequential for the future of online discourse and democracy itself.
Okay, so we've mapped out the human fuel, the resentment, the status anxiety, and we've looked at the digital accelerator those algorithms optimize for outrage. The final, and you could argue most crucial piece of this puzzle is the response. How do democratic institutions, democratic actors actually build resilience? How do they restore functional governance? Let's start with the political actors themselves. How can they win the narrative war against populism?
Yeah, this is critical. The essential strategy here seems to be about depriving the populists of their go-to framing. That simplistic, pure people versus the corrupt elite narrative. So liberal democratic actors, mainstream parties, they have to consciously pivot. They need to start creating unifying, inclusive narratives, stories that highlight shared beliefs, common values, the fundamental institutions we all rely on, the community bonds.
Moving beyond just talking about policy details.
Exactly. They need to move away from focusing solely on the dry mechanics of policy, which can often feel distant, technocratic, maybe even elitist to many voters. Instead, they need to start talking more about the emotional and moral contract that holds society together. What do we owe each other? What do we share?
That sounds like a call to sort of reclaim national identity, but define it in a civic way, not let the populists define it solely by ethnicity or religion.
Absolutely. It's about strategically reclaiming civic nationalism, defining what it means to belong to the nation based on shared values, things like working hard, respecting the rule of law, contributing to your community, upholding democratic norms, rather than letting populists define it narrowly by race or religion or just blind partisan loyalty. And there's actually research suggesting that this kind of unifying civic-minded discourse can sometimes inspire, quote, greater tolerance from the intolerant by offering people a more positive, less exclusionary way to express their connection and loyalty to the nation.
But the public mood is often so pessimistic, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned those French polling numbers. Mainstream actors can't just defend the status quo. They have to offer something hopeful.
They absolutely have to advance aspirational futures. This is crucial. Populists gain so much traction by offering this comforting, nostalgic, but ultimately deceptive vision of returning to some idealized, simpler past. While at the same time, they're constantly stoking anxiety about all the risks ahead.
So the counter-narrative needs to be forward-looking.
Yes. Mainstream actors have to counter that strong emotional pull by painting a positive, opportunity-focused vision of the future. Remember that data point, only 9% of French people in 2018 thought the next generation would be better off. When public pessimism is that deep, the mainstream can't just list risks or demand sacrifices. They have to project confidence, talk about opportunities, chances, possibilities, not just abstract policy tweaks.
Okay, but what about that tactic we sometimes see, where mainstream parties try to beat populists at their own game? Adopting some of their tougher language on issues like immigration or cultural anxieties, trying to win back voters. Does that work?
The research on this borrowing strategy is overwhelmingly negative. Almost always, adopting the rhetoric of right-wing populists turns out to be a losing move for mainstream parties in the long run.
Why is that?
Well, it's often a short-term political gamble, maybe hoping to peel off a few votes, but it comes with extremely high long-term systemic costs. First, it inevitably compromises the mainstream party's own core values, especially around tolerance and pluralism. And second, critically, it actually ends up legitimizing the extremist ideas. It brings them into the mainstream debate, makes them seem more acceptable.
Could you give an example?
Yeah, look at the German Social Democrats, the SPD. Around 2018, they shifted rightwards on migration, making statements like Germany cannot accept all migrants. They were clearly trying to counter the rise of the far-right AfD party.
Did it work?
Not really. It largely failed to win back voters who had already defected to the AfD. But worse, it arguably contributed to the SPD's own long-term decline because it made them seem inauthentic, kind of muddying the waters on their core principles. The lesson seems to be, you can't borrow the populist rhetoric and expect voters to see you as the authentic choice on those issues.
Right. And if the core populist frame is just blanket blame, the elite is corrupt, mainstream actors need to be careful how they criticize or hold power accountable, right?
No.
Otherwise, it might just reinforce that narrative.
Exactly. They have to use blame sparingly and specifically. If liberal democratic actors just resort to blanket condemnations, blaming corrupt politicians in Washington or the whole establishment, they unintentionally end up reinforcing the very populist narrative they're trying to fight. It just gives fuel to the far right's fire.
So what's the alternative? How do you ensure accountability without feeding cynicism?
The key seems to be precision. Accountability needs to be achieved by meticulously pinpointing specific government actors, specific policies, specific failures, and identifying the traceable causes of problems. Don't just blame the government or the system writ large. That targeted approach seems to have a less corrosive effect on overall political trust.
Okay, so that's about the narrative battle. But beyond rhetoric, the long-term defense of democracy relies on strengthening the actual institutional guardrails. And the research highlights two critical unwritten norms that are essential for stability.
Yes, these norms are like the unspoken rules of the game. The crucial gentlemen's agreements, if you like, that keep a democracy healthy and functioning, especially during transitions of power.
What's the first one?
The first is institutional forbearance. This basically means deliberately refraining from using the absolute full extent of your legal power, even if you technically could, if doing so would seriously undermine the democratic system itself or cripple your political opponents for the future.
Forbearance. Like holding back even when the rules let you push further.
Exactly. Think of it like playing a high-stakes game. You might hold cards that guarantee you win this particular hand, but you choose not to play them right now because doing so might smash the table, end the game for everyone, and destroy the possibility of future games.
Can you give examples of what violating forbearance looks like?
Sure, it could be things like trying to pack the courts with loyalists just because you have a temporary majority, or refusing to respect established term limits, even if you might find a legal loophole to challenge them, or maybe excessively using executive orders to completely bypass the legislature on major issues. There was the example of the Czech president, Milo Zeman, who, while often acting within the letter of the law, consistently pushed right up against the norms of forbearance to support his populist ally, Prime Minister Babis, stretching his constitutional powers to the absolute maximum to delay opponents or aid his ally. That erodes the spirit of the system.
Okay, that's forbearance. What's the second crucial norm? This one's about how political opponents see each other.
That's right. It's mutual toleration. This is the fundamental acceptance that your political opponents, even if you profoundly disagree with their vision for the country, are still legitimate rivals. They have a right to exist, to compete for power, to govern if they win. They belong in the system.
They're not enemies of the state.
Exactly. They are not existential threats that must be silenced, destroyed, or imprisoned. As soon as politicians start consistently portraying their opponents as illegitimate, maybe treasonous or dangerous criminals who threaten the nation's very existence, well, that rhetoric justifies using almost any means, including authoritarian ones, to defeat them. And that's the fast track towards democratic breakdown.
So, if these norms are so vital, how can pro-democracy actors spot a leader who might be willing to violate them, a potential authoritarian, before it's too late?
Well, political scientists have developed a pretty useful, generally reliable framework, a checklist essentially, with 4 key observable indicators that can help identify a prospective dictator or someone with strong authoritarian tendencies. We need to pay really close attention when these flags appear.
Okay, let's walk through them. What's the first indicator?
The first is a clear rejection of or weak commitment to the democratic rules of the game. This could be things like refusing to explicitly commit to accepting election results, or constantly claiming elections are rigged without any credible evidence, or maybe challenging the legitimacy of established voting laws just because they might disadvantage your side.
Okay, rejecting the basic rules. What's number 2?
The second is the denial of the legitimacy of political opponents. This is when a leader consistently portrays their rivals not just as wrong, but as fundamentally alien to the national community, calling them criminals, subversives, secret agents, or saying they threaten the very fabric of the country, basically arguing they're illegitimate and shouldn't even be allowed to participate in politics.
Right. Dehumanizing the opposition. What about the third indicator? It deals with violence.
Yes. The third is the toleration or encouragement of violence. This is a big red flag. It includes things like refusing to clearly condemn acts of political violence carried out by their own supporters, or even worse, actively encouraging supporters to engage in aggressive, intimidating, or non-peaceful actions against opponents, journalists, or state institutions.
And the fourth indicator focuses on civil liberties.
Exactly. The fourth is a demonstrated readiness to curtail the civil liberties of opponents, including the media. This shows up as threats to silence critical press outlets, maybe using state power to launch investigations or intimidate political rivals, or trying to suppress the rights of people to peacefully assemble or protest.
So when a politician starts ticking one or more of these boxes,
the alarm bells should be ringing very, very loudly across the entire democratic spectrum.
And when those alarms are ringing, what's the effective strategic response from institutions and other parties? We've seen this united front tactic used sometimes, like in France, as a way to exclude extremists.
Yes, the United Front is a crucial, though sometimes difficult, strategic choice. It requires pro-democracy parties, even those who are normally rivals, to form a consensus specifically to isolate and marginalize extremist actors. The core principle is to refuse any alliance building with them, and critically, to avoid granting them any political legitimacy, refusing to treat them as normal political partners.
So you remind us of the French example?
Sure. In the 2017 French presidential election, after the first round of voting, all the major moderate candidates who were eliminated immediately and publicly endorsed the centrist candidate, Emmanuel Macron. They did this specifically to ensure a decisive defeat for the far-right leader, Marine Le Pen, in the final round. That kind of strategic isolation, that broad consensus against the extremist threat, is seen as vital for protecting democratic health, even if it requires mainstream parties to make temporary political sacrifices or endorse someone they don't fully agree with.
But the threat doesn't always come wearing jackboots, right? Often it's more subtle. It comes through seemingly legal means where populist leaders use the existing laws and institutions to gradually dismantle checks and balances from within. This idea of autocratic legalism.
Autocratic legalism is incredibly insidious precisely because it operates under a cloak of legality. It creates what one scholar memorably called a Frankenstate.
A Frankenstate.
Yeah, a system that keeps the outward appearance, the veneer of being a lawful democracy, but underneath, it's been fundamentally hollowed out. Liberal principles and democratic checks and balances have been systematically pulled apart.
Where have we seen this happening?
Hungary and Poland under recent populist governments are often cited as prime examples. Ruling parties there use their legislative majorities quite systematically to do things like pack constitutional courts with loyalists, change the internal rules of parliamentary procedure to sideline the opposition, or reorganize judicial bodies to consolidate power and drastically reduce judicial independence. They were essentially dismantling democracy using democratic legal tools.
So how on earth do you fight back against an authoritarian strategy that's wrapped in the language of law? The courts, the judiciary seem like the first line of defense there.
They absolutely are. The defense against autocratic legalism requires a fierce, sustained fight to depoliticize the judiciary as much as possible.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, specific solutions often involve reforming how judges are appointed, making sure selections are based genuinely on professional ability, integrity, experience, not on political loyalty or factional ties. It means establishing public, transparent procedures for how judges are selected, evaluated, and retained. And furthermore, you need robust ethics codes, not just for judges, but also for the executive and legislative branches. Codes strong enough to restrain politicians from making unduly harsh or politically motivated attacks on the judiciary that are clearly designed just to undermine public trust in the courts.
Okay, finally, we have to touch on strengthening two other pillars that are constantly under attack in illiberal states: the independent media and civil society. Populists seem to have a standard playbook for undermining them too.
They certainly do. And an independent media is just foundational for any healthy democracy. It's essential for monitoring government officials, for providing citizens with impartial information, for hosting the debates we need to have. Illiberal states use a very predictable illiberal toolbox to weaken the press. Things like government-backed oligarchs buying up critical media outlets, persistent hostile rhetoric aimed at discrediting journalists, calling them enemies of the people, using arbitrary tax investigations to drain independent media of resources, or selectively enforcing laws against critical media figures or owners.
We've seen this lead to significant declines in press freedom in some places.
Absolutely. In countries like Hungary, these systemic efforts have severely compromised media independence over time, contributing directly to downgrades in their international democracy rankings.
So if traditional advertising revenue is shrinking everywhere and political pressure is mounting, especially in places like Central and Eastern Europe, how can independent media even survive?
Survival often requires a multi-pronged approach. It means finding new ways to leverage public funding, private investment, and philanthropic capital to create sustainable financing models for independent news organizations, particularly for those operating in smaller markets or facing intense political hostility and shrinking ad revenues.
Beyond just money, what else is needed?
There needs to be a really strong focus on capacity building for the journalists and the media organizations themselves. This includes things like occupational development and education training journalists, how to operate safely, how to withstand digital threats, legal threats, physical threats. It also means building strong professional associations that can support journalists with fair salaries, insurance, legal aid, and upholding professional standards. Improving media self-scrutiny is important too, fostering a robust internal culture of media criticism to build public trust, and strengthening internal governance within media outlets, clear ethics codes, transparent complaint mechanisms.
And let's not forget the power that lies completely outside formal politics, the power of ordinary citizens, of civil society groups.
Absolutely critical. The power of organized civil resistance can be an extraordinary check on authoritarian creep. Because ultimately, all political power, even authoritarian power, derives from the consent of the governed.
How does civil resistance work then?
It works through nonviolent action. This can include acts of commission, things like mass protests, demonstrations, marches, but also, crucially, acts of omission, things like boycotts, labor strikes, coordinated withdrawals of cooperation. History shows that large-scale, diverse, nonviolent civil resistance movements have a remarkable track record of being able to coerce transformative concessions, even from entrenched regimes, provided they mobilize enough people and maintain nonviolent discipline.
So what are the keys for civil society groups to maximize their impact? When facing these kinds of strategic threats, what does effective strategy look like?
Well, several things seem crucial. First, they must aim for broad, diverse, and large-scale participation. Research shows movements with high levels of participation from across society are significantly more likely to succeed than small, centralized vanguard groups. Second, they need to consciously model democratic practices internally. Operate with transparency, build consensus, show the alternative. Third, they need to define clear, actionable, specific goals, not just vague, maximalist ambitions like overthrow the regime tomorrow. What are the concrete steps? And finally, critically, they must employ a diverse range of non-violent tactics. Don't just rely on street protests. Use boycotts, strikes, civil disobedience, voter registration drives, election monitoring, parallel institutions. Constantly pivot to apply pressure from different angles.
Can you give an example of that pivot?
A good example is the A Decent Slovakia movement. It started with huge street protests demanding accountability after a journalist's murder, pushing out corrupt officials. But then, recognizing the limits of protest alone, it strategically pivoted towards electoral mobilization. They actively started working with and endorsing pro-democracy political candidates to try and achieve lasting systemic change through the ballot box, not just through demonstrations. That tactical flexibility is key.
It seems like this confluence of strategies, from politicians choosing their words carefully, to institutions holding firm, down to citizens mobilizing in smart ways, is what's needed to halt this erosion and hopefully restore some democratic vibrancy.
If you boil it all down, I think the core challenge we've discussed is this really devastating convergence. On one side, you have these deep-seated human psychological needs, the desire for group status, the sting of resentment, that urge for payback. And on the other side, you have these modern digital platforms whose algorithms are essentially mathematically optimized to activate those very feelings, to sustain that polarization because, frankly, it's profitable. And that creates a political environment where these simplified, emotional, often demagogic narratives just spread much more easily and are much harder to counter than careful, constructive, policy-based debate.
So the defense against this kind of systemic erosion, it clearly isn't going to be simple. There's no single silver bullet. It really requires this multi-layered response, doesn't it? With actors playing their part at every level. Political parties have to choose inclusive, aspirational language, form those united fronts against extremism. Tech companies need to grapple with restructuring their fundamental algorithmic incentives, moving away from pure engagement at all costs. And then citizens need to be actively supporting independent institutions like the free press and impartial courts, and be ready to engage in smart, nonviolent civic action when necessary. The whole system depends on these different political and institutional guardrails holding firm.
Exactly. And, while the liberal democratic approach, the one that insists on trying for truthfulness, for inclusivity, for nuance, while that approach often feels like taking the high road and maybe faces a much harder strategic challenge than the purely emotional, outrage-driven tactics of populists, history is pretty clear. Ultimately, it's the strategic decisions made by countless individuals and groups, both inside government and outside of it, decisions about upholding those norms of forbearance and mutual toleration, about how to engage, about what lines not to cross. Those are the decisions that will determine whether democratic vibrancy and resilience can actually be restored.